right, welcome everyone. My name is Chris Wright, and today you are joined by some of the, I guess, kind of most interesting, influential, and potentially informed journalists from different parts of the world. And we're going to be talking a little bit about COP28, what it was, what happened, how it all came apart, how it all got back together again at the end, and hopefully giving some insights into our experiences at COP28, and hopefully giving some chances for you to ask some questions as well. So my name is Chris Wright, and I work at Climate Tracker, and I was one of the lucky ones to join COP28. And I'm joined with a couple of friends who I saw there. So, Tais, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Chris, and hi, everyone. I'm Tais Gadea Lara. I'm a climate journalist based and from Argentina. We are not going to talk about politics of my country now, and I have been covering the climate negotiations since 2014.
All right, and joining Tais is Stuti Mishra as well. Stuti, I could probably have a go at trying to introduce you, but I'm guessing you might be a little bit better at doing that than I would. So do you want to maybe say hello as well?
Sure. Hi. I'm Stuti. I work with The Independent. I'm the Asia climate correspondent. So this was my second in-person COP last year with Climate Tracker and this year on my own. So I was looking at it initially from a Asia perspective as well, but then mostly from an international perspective for what is going to be interesting for independent readers. So yeah.
All right, and finally, kind of rounding out our panel is our only journalist from the Caribbean, and was actually, I think, Climate Tracker's first in-person journalist from the Caribbean for a number of years last year, but came back and decided that he wanted to relive the nightmare again this year. Ryan, are you glad that you did so? And can you introduce yourself a little bit better than my obvious kind of comical intro?
I don't think you're ever really happy while you're in the storm, but when you get out of it, you're very happy that you were there and you were able to provide some very good coverage. So I'm Ryan Bachoo, like Chris was saying, I'm from the Caribbean. I work for a multimedia network called CNC3 Television, and by extension, the Trinidad and Tobago Guardian newspaper. And I would have focused less on the Latin American side, but more on the Caribbean side, but altogether Latin America and the Caribbean at COP28 and at COPs in general. When I cover climate change, that's basically my focus.
All right. Well, we're going to be prodding you with a range of questions, and as well as with Tais and Stuti soon. So hopefully we'll learn a little bit more why exactly you didn't see the light of your ways in the last 12 months, and how you're going to go about your next 12 months so that you actually don't put yourself through this drama again. But for today's webinar, I had a bit of a thought yesterday, and that thought was that for a lot of these webinars that different organizations run for different audiences, we think a lot about the content. We think a lot about kind of giving people space, presentations, and we maybe think a little bit less about the entertainment value. So one of the most entertaining things that I like to indulge in sometimes is sports television, and not necessarily watching the games, but just listening to old retired people shout at each other and pretend like they have some scientific basis for that argument, and then pretend like they're just as important as the much younger people they're talking about. And I think that's basically the fundamentals of all sports television. It's not so complicated, and they manage to create content for themselves every day of the week, even though most of their sports only do it once a week. It's, I think, actually a marvelous formula. And I have thankfully been allowed by our three kind of special guests to try out the same formula with them today. So we're going to be doing kind of like a hot seat round of questions. I'm going to throw these questions out to each of our guests to kick it off. Hopefully we'll get a few arguments. Hopefully those arguments will be civil. But I'm hoping that this kind of draws out a few insights from these guests that maybe wouldn't come through a different format. And if you have thoughts, if you have reactions, throw them up there. Zoom has the reactions buttons. I do want to kind of see little love hearts or smiley faces or frowny faces, I don't know, throughout. And I do hope also that if you get any kind of thoughts or comments that you want to throw in or questions you want to throw in, use that kind of the comment section of this while we get through our bulk of the questions. And then if there's a questions you don't feel like was properly answered, we're probably going to have a bit of time for it at the end, but we'll see how long the arguments go for. And certainly if an argument's getting a little bit tasty, we won't turn it off. But why don't we go to you first, Ryan, since you're on the screen. COP was the biggest ever. How did that feel as a journalist? And was it maybe too big?
Yeah, I think it was too big. You know, that might sound a little bit cliche and people might say, but that's a good thing. Not necessarily. The venue itself, I remember visiting the Green Zone just once. It tires you out as a journalist. There's a lot, as with every COP, there's a lot of walking to do, a lot of miles to put in. And the venue itself it was just a disadvantage of being so big. I thought it was very well structured in the sense that the media center where that was positioned, and then the plenary and the media stakeout room, all within great proximity. But the venue itself, it showed me that there are disadvantages. Egypt was, you know, not as big, manageable maybe in the size of the United Arab Emirates, but certainly this COP venue showed me that there are disadvantages to having such a big venue with so much walking to so many pavilions. The CARICOM pavilion, which was an important pavilion for me, took me 15 minutes to get to. That's an important pavilion for me to get to every day. That's difficult. And then I had an interview at the Green Zone, got lost, got found, got lost again before actually finding the place. So having a huge venue, I think, while it may seem like it's a great thing, it really has its disadvantages.
But surely in terms of inclusion, which is very, very important, particularly for people from across the Caribbean and from smaller countries in particular, isn't it important to have a venue that big or a conference that can accommodate as many people as possible?
I think so, yeah. But in terms of the logistics of it, perhaps so. But from a journalistic standpoint, and perhaps even from other delegates' standpoint, it's just incredibly difficult to maneuver the entire environment of COP when it's that big. And a lot of this maneuvering that I speak about, we all do it on our feet. I'm not sure how many people actually used the buggy that was available during COP. You know, I remember people, you know, switching from heels to sneakers. I remember people getting very tired. I was one of them, getting very tired, you know, a few days in, mainly because you're on your feet all day and because you're working up these miles with your feet. And COP is a marathon. You don't want to be sort of, you know, running around for the first few days, and then by midway through the marathon, it's difficult for you to complete it.
No, that's fair enough. Tais, you've seen a couple of these, including, you know, I guess, kind of some people's mind, the biggest in Paris, not in terms of participation, but the biggest in terms of impact. What do you think about the size of COP28, and did it add value or did it take away from it in terms of an overall experience?
I think that we need to talk about the scale of COPs, the latest COP, because it feels like it's something that every COPs needs to be larger than the previous one. And we need to talk in terms of, not in regards of affecting the inclusion, but yes, maybe asking us the question, what is the purpose of a COP? And the main important thing at COPs is the work on the negotiations. So I think that most of the people that are going to COPs are not going to follow or to work at the negotiations. They are going to different side events that they are important, but maybe they are taking too much of the attention, and they are, you know, in the daily basis, they are making too much harder work for us who are following, covering, or working on the negotiations. So maybe we need to start, you know, talking about maybe do a climate expo with all, you know, like the marketing thing and the side events, and then do a COP more similar to the SB, you know, like the intersessional meetings that we have every June in order to try to focus on the negotiations, because I do believe that this is affecting the negotiations. I remember in Glasgow, or even last year, it was like the end of the first week, and we didn't knew anything about the status of the negotiations, because the only thing that politicians were talking about were about pledge. That pledge are really good is when they say, for example, we are going to halt deforestation by 2030, but they do not have any process then to follow and to have a proper implementation. It's not that it's not like the process that we do have for the Paris Agreement. So maybe my answer is not a happy one for everyone, but I think it's a discussion that we need to have, because it was, as Ryan was saying, logistically was really, really difficult for us to be on the ground. And I think that for everyone, but thinking in terms of the most important thing of every climate COP, that is the negotiations.
And it's an interesting reflection. When COVID obviously overcame the negotiations, there was a lot of discussions around, how these negotiations could all be online going forward. And obviously we didn't necessarily need to kind of all be there. And obviously there was a bit of a collective forgetfulness of that notion, I guess, in the last 2 years, and particularly this year. 100,000 people reportedly were registered for COP28 throughout the 2 weeks. They shifted what was in historically a kind of a 2-week registration minimum. In kind of the last 2 years, they shifted that to weekly registrations, and this year was a daily registration opportunity. So that made up some of the extra numbers. I think it's arguable whether or not there was more than 50,000 per day, and I don't know if anyone really was able to dive into that number, but certainly the biggest in terms of total registrants, and the biggest venue that I've seen in my years of covering this as well. So I think, Stuti, it sounds like we might not get a kind of, no, it needs to be big and it needs to be bigger than it was type of side there. So I might switch to the next one for you. Let's dive into the negotiations. These negotiations started on November 30th and dived in pretty quickly to what's called the Leaders Summit. What were some of the, I guess, kind of key memories for you from the Leaders Summit, and what were some of the key things you reported on?
I think the first 2-3 days of focus always remains on leaders and big statements and what people are talking about. So for me, the first 3 days were mostly that. Basically, I was following King Charles, I was following Rishi Sunak, I was following Kamala Harris, and I was a lot of focus was on the fact on who is coming and who's not coming, and less on actually what they eventually say. So it was mainly like, the big moments of all the leaders walking together, standing together, the picture sessions and all of that. It's like it becomes a lot about color at that point, like any other conference. So climate does sort of take a little bit of a backseat, or like, the details of what the pledges actually mean take a little bit of a backseat. We just sort of focus on, these were the announcements. And this COP was very like active from the very first day. Things kept happening. First day, loss and damage happened. Second day, leaders started arriving. Everybody was making big announcements. People were making, people were talking about a lot of things. So I always find that time a little chaotic, but I think it's very it's also very good for a very general newspaper sort of coverage, where you make it clear like where each country stands. So when you have two people from the UK coming and speaking, you actually can, talk about a little bit what actually is happening in the UK, and how they are positioned in these climate negotiations, and what eventually, whatever comes out of the at the end of the talks, what it's going to mean for them and things like that. So I think interesting for me was definitely King Charles' speech, because I think there was a lot of scope to compare what is being said and what is actually happening. And other leaders were also, I mean, everybody was talking about very idealistic things, but I think that's a good time to reflect a little bit in terms of, how you can connect what is happening in the climate negotiations for everybody else who does not follow climate negotiations but follows politics, but wants to understand what the positions are. So I think that is an interesting thing to do. Other than that, I think everything else sort of does get a little sidelined for the first 3 days. Nobody really talks about the nitty-gritties of the negotiations or the final deal. It becomes very much, big face focused, or how many people are in the auditorium and things like that.
And Ryan, from the Caribbean, how did the kind of leaders from the region turn up or maybe not turn up in those first couple of days?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I would think that previous COPs, there was this huge commercialization, for lack of a better word, branding of the Caribbean message and the Caribbean voice at both COP26 and COP27. This time around, there was a common message, but I think what would have thrown off, and this is just my opinion, but I think what threw off Caribbean leadership in the early part of the Leaders Summit at this COP was the fact that loss and damage funding was operationalized on the first day. That was a huge deal in this COP, because it was obviously an agenda item last year, and I think few people would have expected that on day one, Sultan Al Jaber would have delivered, loss and damage funding as adopted it at COP28. So I feel like it was a little bit blindsided. I feel that was the message that the Caribbean leadership came, that we had gotten this initial victory at COP27 on loss and damage funding becoming an agenda item. Now let's go and let's push this thing home over the next 2 weeks. They pushed it home over the first day. So I thought that sort of threw off their message a little bit, because loss and damage fund, now you had to sort of pivot. What do you say about loss and damage fund? On day one, you already got what you wanted or what you came for. So I thought what they pivoted to was climate finance. Okay, so now we have the loss and damage fund. How many nations are going to fill this fund? We want $400 billion, or at least it is estimated that it will cost $400 billion each year to stave off the effects of climate change. How much of that is actually going to be filled? One. And then obviously the climate finance aspect of it, of having access. The big question after that, that no Caribbean leader, well, at least they started posing, is, okay, we now know that we have the fund established. How do we now know who's going to get it? Are the Pacific Islands going to get the money before us in the Caribbean? Are their damage much more important than ours? So I thought loss and damage funding being adopted on day one of this summit really threw a spoke in the wheel of what Caribbean leadership would have wanted to say in the first 2 or 3 days of this summit, and they had to go back now and say, well, okay, what is our common theme? What is our common message? And that would have had to be filling the fund, one, and then access to climate finance through things like the Green Climate Fund, etc.
So it sounds like a pretty smart strategy if you were aiming to kind of take some of the wind out of people's sails in particular. Tais, you've been covering these a couple of years, maybe a couple of years longer than most people in our audience, in fact. If anyone's going to do a bet,
don't tell me that I am the old person.
No. You obviously started when you were a teenager. So, but if anyone's going to do a bet leading into one of these things, and kind of, if anyone's going to get a tip off around how they should bet, I'm guessing you'd be one person they might want to ask advice from. Would you have predicted what happened on the loss and damage fund leading into it?
Of course. I mean, but in 2 ways. First of all, as a strategy from the presidency, and particularly from the president Al Jaber, because they really put the focus on what the media was saying and was writing. And previous the beginning of COP, we have this big investigation regarding how Al Jaber was taking advantage of some meetings that he has during the year, meetings with different persons from different governments around the world, that were meetings that were supposed to be about COP28, but at the same time, he was trying to make some agreements about oil and gas production, because he's also the CEO of ADNOC. So of course, for him, it was going like to be something really good if we as media were talking about something else that was not that investigation and talking about, hey, the first day we have an agreement on the loss and damage fund, the operationalization, because the fund was established last year. But at the same time, for the other reason for me, it was because on the previous weeks, and after the last meeting of the transitional committee that we have about the fund, we hear from different parties that the text was a text that nobody liked, but also was a text that nobody want to reopen because for a discussion, because they know it was like the best imperfect text that they could have, and if they reopen for the discussion, the result could be worse. So for me, it was not a surprise that on first one, maybe I will guess to the second day or the third day, not maybe the first one, but with these two things in consideration, like all the attention that was having Algebra and the COP28 presidency, and regarding that there was no party that want to reopen that text to discussion, I think it was pretty obvious that was going like to happen on the first days of the COP. And on that, you can say, well, okay, yes, it's historical that we have something on the first day. Well, technically, yes, but I don't know if I would talk about the text as something that is historic, considering that we have that now the fund is going to be under the World Bank temporarily during 4 years. I don't know if the Global South, when they talked last year about something independent, I don't know if they were thinking about the World Bank, but as I mentioned, they say it's an imperfect text, but it's the best text that they could have on this. And well, Ryan also mentioned things about some money that was already pledged for the fund. And come on, US, $17.5 million dollars, that is nothing. And we know that.
Yeah.
Well,
Chris, just really quickly. Yeah, I'm sorry, but I also think on Thais's point, it's a very quick win. It's a very quick kill for the COP presidency. And if you have a look at what was said in the build up to COP, and I mean literally on the eve of COP, you had Simon Steele and Antonio Guterres calling for a complete phase out of fossil fuels in a country that produces oil and gas, in a country that has a COP28 president who's a chief executive officer. I thought it was an incredibly great strategic move for Al-Jaber to give himself this early win. Let it splash all over the newspapers that loss and damage funding has been approved and operationalized. Give himself an early win, and then we can get back to all of the talk about phase out, which was obviously going to be a heated conversation and lead to great disparity at this COP.
Yes, but do we have a phase out on the final text? No.
See, I promised you a little bit of tasty argument. Looks like we're just building up to it. So we don't have it yet, but I feel like this is going to come soon. Stuti, you probably have some thoughts on this as well. Now, is loss and damage the big success story from COP28, or did it actually mean that other elements suffered throughout?
I think because of the first day announcement, other elements did not suffer. It made sense that it was just sort of, done on the very first day. Of course, I mean, I'm completely agreeing with Ryan. For me, it was also a little bit of a surprise because on the first day, I was not mentally prepared that this was going to drop. I thought, I thought the text was going to be reopened for discussion. It just made sense that there's going to be discussion about, what and where and how and things like that. And I thought that's definitely, I'm going to be writing about it for the entire 2 weeks. I was very sure. So my plans suffered a little bit because of this first day announcement. But I think, yeah, once it was out of the way, all the focus was on other pledges, on loss and damage pledges that were coming in, and other funds, and also the phase out of fossil fuels. So everything was centered around that. I think, I mean, I don't know. I don't really have general opinions like, is it a success or is it not? Because I always feel like there's so much to explain to people. Because when it comes to funds like these, I don't think anybody really understands how these things, not a lot of people actually understand how these things work generally. The idea is that, okay, you have this fund which is operational now and the countries are making pledges. And when people hear those pledges, of course, the first thing is that people can put that in perspective as journalists when we are reporting on it, that how much is needed and how much is actually being pledged. But even when the money is being pledged, it's not really reaching anybody yet. But when you hear about these big announcements, you feel like, oh, US is giving like, this 2 billion, $1 billion. It sounds like a big deal, but at the end, it's nothing. It's just a statement made in a speech. And you don't know if that's going to reach or not. So, yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
basically just putting all of that in context takes a little bit of time. And last year, I think I was reporting a lot on those things like, oh, this person said this person said that. This year, I was focusing on putting those things in context a little bit. That what does it actually mean? If someone's saying something, it does not mean the money has been given. If the fund is now operational, yes, maybe a success, but does it really change anything for people who have had, who have suffered disasters this year, or people who are actually waiting for money, even for Pakistan flood victims? Does it really mean anything to them? So I think that kind of context is important when talking about financial pledges or funds, for people to make sense of it.
Stuti, if I would go a step further and I would add to what you have just said in saying that if, as Chris' question would have mentioned, if loss and damage funding was the biggest thing to come out of COP28, then COP28 was a failure. Because for the very reason, what is it if I tell Chris, I promise you I'm going to put $100 into your bank account. It's just a promise. I've never said that I'm going to, I haven't actually done it as yet. And that's all that we have, 700 million, or a little bit less, $690 million in promises, in pledges. We don't even, if you want to call loss and damage funding being one, the biggest, and two, a success at COP28, then we should have emerged out of Dubai with one, not only promises, but payments, and two, we should have a criteria in who is going to get the money, how they're going to get it, what is the, but instead we're still working out all of that over the next year as we head to Azerbaijan. So, if I maintain, if loss and damage funding was the biggest thing to come out of COP28, then COP28 did not live up to what it's supposed to do.
Fair enough, but I think there's a lot of people who maybe have other questions around what was COP meant to live up to as well. And I think that kind of going into COP, certainly a lot of people question whether a fossil fuel exporting country as a host, and certainly a fossil fuel exporting professional as Dr. Sultan Al Jaber is, as you mentioned, the CEO of a company such as that, could even be the host. Now, how did you feel, Stuti? I might go to you on this one. How did you feel leading up to it? And then how did that feeling change over the course of COP?
Leading up to it, I think it was very interesting coverage wise. I have never actually seen a lot of focus on the COP president. Like he was almost like a celebrity. Everything about him was big news. And I think even general readers and people who don't follow climate negotiations closely were aware of that name. And that to me is pretty surprising. Um, and a lot was happening, I think, like from the time he was announced president. I think everything since then has been very happening in terms of coverage. So this was a very interesting COP from that perspective. But I think once we arrived there, I was just trying to, again, just try to put it in perspective for people. It's not the first time a petrostate is hosting climate negotiations, and it's not the only country that, is basically also working on renewables but has its economy dependent on oil. So I think that context was a little important, that people can sometimes have certain image for certain countries that, oh, this country is this, but then a lot of Western countries who have hosted COPs in previous years are also have also been fossil dependent economies, or like their role can also be scrutinized. So I think that was one perspective I was trying to bring a little bit moving into the COP negotiations. But once I was there, I think there was a lot. Like the first question, my views were pretty similar to both of the, both Thais and Ryan. I think once you arrive, you actually do see that touch at the venue of like so much of it felt like a corporate event. It was full of fossil fuel executives. There was so much distraction everywhere. And yes, like the scale and everything, we can always talk about why, COPs, it's a good thing for COPs to get bigger or for more people to have interest. But then a lot of activists were saying the same thing, that uh, number of people from corporates is rising, but number of people from civil society is not rising. So, or not at the same scale. Like more people are joining from companies and from, different places which were never part of climate negotiations. But then civil society, which is supposed to have more and more participation, is just not finding its own space. And I was very happy. I think after visiting Dubai, I was very happy with the way Egypt handled it for some reason, because I felt like I met a lot more people in Egypt than in this COP summit. So I was handed out a lot of cards from fossil fuel executives, so that's one thing I have a lot more this year. But in Egypt, there were a lot of events that were focused on the premise and all the things that were happening around in the climate world at that point. A lot of the discussions were focused on that. I was able to attend a lot of those discussions. This year was so interesting in some ways that this was the hottest year in human history, said to be the hottest year. So many heat waves, so many droughts, so many wildfires happened. And I'm sure there must have been discussions about it in the venue. I just never saw any of them. So
Well,
if I am finding it so, overpowered by corporate lobbies and fossil fuel executives, I'm sure others must have also seen that. So to me, I think once you're there, that becomes the focus instead of what has happened in the past. Of course, you give a little bit of a summary of, that these were also the controversies, but then I think that was the main thing for me. If that wasn't happening, I would have been, I think, okay with whoever was leading it and whatever was happening, and just focus on what actually comes out in the final deal. But because of that presence, I think it became a big deal that, hey, like, you had a certain image, you had so many controversies, and now your summit looks like this. So, yeah.
For me, Chris, if I can add to what Stuti say, I really try to make a lot of work on not to focus on him, because I think it was something that most of the media were doing. But what I really try, yes, to focus is on, because of the country that we have as the presidency of the COP, and because of the conflict of interest that he represents, how that could impact on the negotiation. And I think that you can see that in two ways. First of all, is the second year in the history of COPs that we do not have the civil society mobilization outside the venue. And I think that is not something good, that we need to have only inside the venue and under authorization of UN, the mobilization of civil society. Is the second time. The first one was in Egypt last year. And I'm talking about this in terms of the transparency of the process and the inclusion and participation. And the other thing is that, again, what we are seeing in similar of what we saw last year in Egypt is that we do not having plenaries of discussion. It's like most of the discussions are behind doors. Some of the meetings with observers, some of them not even with observers. And what I remember from previous COPs, even the COPs after Paris, is that we do have a draft text, we go to the plenary, we see some of the different opinions of the countries, then they have meetings, then we have another draft text, then we have a plenary. And now we are not having that. And I think that this is affecting that, like the transparency of the process, because we need to see that kind of discussions. And in this COP, it was a decision of the presidency and the president of COP28 to do some things really in a strange way, like, well, let's change the agenda. Let's now talk about the global stock tax. We are going to have an agreement on this. After that, no, please don't open microphone yet. We are going to do some other items, agenda agreements, and then you can talk. And it was something like, really? And there was something that we were talking with different people around, like inside the venue, that, hey, this is the first time that I'm seeing this. So I think that besides the marketing or the spectacular titles that he could have, or maybe the next COP president could have of a COP, is how the country or the person who is leading the coordination of the negotiation could have a negative impact on the negotiation itself and on the transparency of the process.
Yeah, Chris, I just want to add something very quickly to this. It's a different perspective, I think, from, and I was having the conversation at COP28. I think one of the things we need to consider when it comes to these COPs now is how expensive they are. COPs are, these conferences are incredibly expensive. And what are we now emerging out of? The world is now emerging out of a pandemic. A lot of the economies are now getting back to where they want to be or where they used to be. Who can host these conferences? Countries with money. Who has the money? Oil and gas producing nations. So it's not easy for the United Nations to just go to any country within the Middle East or Europe and say, hi, we'd like you to host COP. I can't afford it, I'm sorry. So I think it's very important, just as a side note, that we understand how incredibly expensive these conferences are to run.
Oh, absolutely. And on running these conferences, I actually kind of had a moment where I was chatting with some friends in one of the future hosting conferences, and I said that, oh, next year we're going from a petrol state to another state, and then after that we'll be hitting a coal state, whether it is Turkey or Australia, and then India has put their bid in for COP23, so another state that's very much dependent on producing and consuming coal. And then my friends, if you can guess, from that country's delegation said, oh, that's so nice you didn't call us a petrol state as well. So I think that you're highlighting that this relationship between money, between fossil fuels, between the COP conferences is a relationship that's going to continue at least for the next 5 years, and a relationship that's always going to be one that's hard to navigate. But while you're on screen there, Ryan, let's walk people through, if you can. You're the one with the TV experience. After week one, there was a particular moment in the second week where, after a day of almost no action at all, a day of almost no negotiations that were openly understood, suddenly some messages started getting spread around, and some words, like a document, started getting passed around, and no one was really able to confirm it, but certainly everyone that I spoke to and was asking about it said, yeah, we just got this as well. And then suddenly that document appeared on the UNFCCC website. And very, very soon after, as a journalist, I'm guessing you started receiving messages saying there's going to be a media press release here, a media huddle there, a kind of a statement there. What exactly happened that, and then what exactly happened straight after what I just described?
Yeah, a lot of information was being passed around, and you couldn't verify what the information was. And I think you're building up to the announcement that Bachoo was to be named as
sorry, I was talking about the draft text, the first draft text that we all got.
Right, right, and nobody could really verify. This is heading down to the end of COP. Nobody could really verify the draft text. Nobody could verify what time that text would actually officially be sent out by the UNFCCC. Nobody knows when the next plenary session would have been taking place. It was all very, confusing, if not chaotic, and you have the president of COP28 saying that he was going to speak to the media, then he pulled out, he came back, called another stakeout, pulled out again. So it was a lot of confusion. And during those hours, you just wondered what was happening behind the scenes, if anything really major was happening behind the scenes except chaos and confusion. And ultimately, sort of relied on your sources, and you sort of hope that your sources are right. You sort of hope that your sources, and this is one time that you sort of have to forgive your sources as well, because things are so fluid. It's changing. They may tell you that your draft text is going to drop at 11 p.m. And then you hear, well, they're going to go into meetings until 2 a.m. and come back at, I remember Stuti saying, I think it was Stuti saying 6 a.m. and somebody else saying 9 a.m. and somebody else, so it was a lot of chaos and confusion happening. And my best advice for myself and for everybody else is to just hold on as tight as you could. And just try not to fall off, because it's a really tough time at the conference, not unprecedented, but it's a very tough time. And it's one, that ultimately you trust your sources as best as possible, but they too may not necessarily be wrong, but things may have changed in between the time that they told you and what the UNFCCC, the movement of the UNFCCC. But yeah, that was a very confusing, chaotic time and a very tiring, frustrating time. Cheryl and I just decided, you know what, screw it, we're going for dinner.
And I'm guessing that was Cheryl, a reporter from Straits Times.
Yeah.
Stuti, that kind of first draft text that came out, you obviously reported on it, as most journalists tried to report on it. Looking back on that day, looking back on your reporting on that day, and looking back on then maybe what happened in the next kind of 24, 48, 72 hours, what are your kind of thoughts on that, and kind of what are your memories in terms of what was released in that text versus, you know, what ended up in the final text?
So when the text was, again, there was a lot of confusion, and when finally the text came out, for me, I think only way to make sense of that text and to report was to actually ask, how does it actually matter? I mean, it is a draft text at the end of the day. There's going to be, couple more updates, and then final deal will come out. So if I'm going to tell people that this document is important, I need to explain why it is important and what does it actually indicate. So towards the end, I think I was just focusing on just picking up bits from experts and whatever the sentiment is on the ground to talk about what are we going to get eventually, and basically how that's going to affect your life. It was just as simple as that for me. So a lot of the nuances of the language was not something I was purposefully reporting on. I was leaving those things out because there are a lot of things that we get very excited by when we are at the ground and we are talking to people, because everybody around us is very excited by those things. Every single word, people have like at length discussions about every single word. Nobody cares about it outside of that venue. That's like one thing I realized later, because we've been talking about fossil fuel phase down and phase out for 2 years. Wrote a lot of stories about it, and I don't know, like, does it really make a difference when a normal person hears it? I'm not sure, and not a lot of people will actually even see the difference. So phase out was not included in the draft text. That was definitely a big update, but I was trying to lead as much with the help of experts who break down things in very easy language, and people who can actually connect it with their own experiences. So when leaders from small islands speak, when leaders from Africa speak, just trying to include all those voices, because that makes sense when you read them. uh, it basically gives you an indication that, okay, these countries are not happy. They are going to try to change what has been given out in this text. That to me, I think, is an interesting update for anybody reading about COP28, other than the fact that, oh, this word is not how people wanted it to be. This word is what people are, fighting over. And this technical bit is how it's supposed to be. So I was just trying to leave out a lot of dry information out of my reporting this time. So that's how I just perceived it. When it came, I was like, okay, let's just breathe. Let's talk to people. Whoever gives me best quotes, explains it, breaks it down well, I will report that, and I'll wait for reactions from countries. I will not get into like, oh my God, let me just try and be like the first person to report this document that has just dropped.
It's an interesting reflection. And on that, Tais, how did you go about reporting on the final agreement? So if we skip from the draft to the final agreement, did you focus on those words, or were you focusing on that sentiment that Stuti was talking about?
On the particularly word that was chosen, but in regards on its content, because as a Spanish speak person, of course, I need to translate into Spanish all those beautiful English that maybe in English had a particular meaning. And after in Glasgow, talk with the translator about what is phase out and phase down and how can I explain in Spanish. During these 2 weeks in Dubai, I was talking also, okay, what is the best translation for unabated? And when transitioning away from fossil fuels appears, I was like, what the fuck? What is going on right now? How am I going to translate that? And I think that happened even for other persons that need to communicate, like in other language. But not only in terms what I was most really interesting to talk about with the translator, that they are at least the one that I asked, they both have already translated some UN documents, so they know like the legal part of action of the documents. It was not only about the exact meaning or how to explain in Spanish. It was also, and most importantly, about is this language more weak, or is as strong as face out or face down? That was for me like the most important thing, because, for example, the Minister of Climate of Denmark, he answered me, no, this transition away from fossil fuel is as strong as phase out. And we were talking with Chris like, no, it's not. I mean, if Saudi Arabia is happy with this text, that cannot be as strong as phase out. So in fact, both of the translator and other experts, they agree that transitioning away from fossil fuel is not a stronger vocabulary in comparison with phase out or even with phase down. But it was not only that. If we see all the segment on the text that talks about the energy transition, we also see some weak language in regards of fossil fuels, transitional fossil fuels, that could open, you know, like the window to, for example, gas. That is something that from US to Argentina, a lot of politicians love to talk about how gas is the resource for the transition. We also can see in the text that even when they talk about the need to, increase renewable energy, in the text also talks about trying to encourage another low carbon technology like carbon capture, that it's something that petrostates and the oil and gas industry loves to put the focus on. And I think most important that the verb here is not that the countries shall do, or it's something that they need to compromise for, but instead we are seeing that it's something that they need to contribute. Like these are global efforts that they need to contribute to do. So I think that I always try to do like a little of technical analysis, but not in regards of the particular meaning or translation of the words, but trying to see if it is weak or not, or if it's weak or strong in terms of the actions ahead. Because the most important thing is not that the COP ends with the text, it's what comes next. I mean, that now how the countries try to implement and put in actions those texts. So even Simon Steele, at the end, in his last speech that he did to press, he says that the text brings a lot of open of interpretation. That is, like, there's a lot of things that every country could interpret it in different way, and I don't think that is particularly good. The second part of what I say is my opinion, not Simon Steele, but he agreed with what Samoa and the island countries say at the plenary. So I think yes, and something that here the discussion was a lot of should we talk about success or a failure? I think after Paris, we shouldn't talk about none of them. This is not about having a new agreement. We already have an agreement. This is about how to work to how to implement better the Paris Agreement, and with more ambitious and in a more just way. So I think, of course, for our producers or editors, they love us to talk about that a copy is historical, or that we have a success or a failure here. But I think that we need to talk about the things that are good, the things that maybe are not really good, the things that sucks, of course. But I think that, yes, maybe it's a mix of feelings, but every COP should be a mix of feelings. The question is, who is the party? Who is the country?
I've been asked almost every day since the end of COP by a friend or a family member or some stranger who just kind of heard that I worked in the climate space, you know, some perspective on COP. This is not good enough. This is like amazing. This is, you know, a success failure, like Tais said. I just kind of wonder, particularly coming from you know, the context of reporting, particularly in South Asia, where fossil fuel energy demand, where population growth, so many things are expanding at such a rapid rate. The context of saying that this language is not good enough is often a context that kind of European audiences, for example, can really relate to and can say, yeah, absolutely, this is not good enough. We need to kind of respect the science and do things now. But I feel like that response might be different in other geographies. How has been the response from like maybe your friends, family, other relations, but also some of your readers in terms of the way that you tried to call the final outcome?
I think, like you said, the responses for me in the place where I live and the place where I, for which I report, are always two different extremes. What I see in India is a very different take on climate and climate summits, and what I hear from, in the comment sections and the people I report for, the British audience, the American audience, that's always very different. So when it comes to a very strong take on fossil fuels, yes, there's always going to be a discussion that, because European leaders speak about it and American leaders, and everybody talks about a strong language and strong output at the end of the day, at the end of the summit. So you'll see readers talking about the same thing, but the moment you mention finance, you'll see everybody confused. Nobody really can make sense that how are you connecting finance with fossil fuel transition? We are just saying, stop burning coal. And then when you try to explain that, no, you're saying stop burning coal, but that needs money. And that money needs to come from, the other side of the globe. So that connection is not something people can understand very easily. And I think in India, and in South Asia in general, yes, there is, at least in the last few years, I have seen interest sort of increasing about climate summits, about, what is happening and what should happen. But I don't think everybody would be of the opinion that, oh yeah, it's a good thing, let's stop burning coal. Because it's a very, clear thing in everybody's head that India's economy needs to grow, we need more jobs, we need, more money to come in, and coal is a very important resource. We need more electricity. So for me, when I was analyzing it and I was trying to keep both sides of audiences in mind, for me, the idea was to at least explain that this is a signal for the markets and this is a signal for investors, and how the growing trend is going to be going forward. It's not something that, oh, India will stop using coal the next day. That's not what the outcome of this COP is. Or in a few years, that's also not happening. But it's basically an indication of where countries are supposed to head in the future. And for that, like, obviously, there's a lot of renewable investment happening here in India as well, and in other South Asian countries as well. So I think when you talk about those things, like over the decade changes, it starts to make a little more sense to people. And it also, maybe, like, headlines can be sometimes a little more overarching and make it sound like a more absolute thing, but when you get into the story, I think that's what people are trying to understand. Because again, it's a very complicated thing to explain that there's been an agreement that has called for transition away from fossil fuels. What does that mean? Every country in the world, almost like most of the countries, are burning fossil fuels in some ways or another. So, explaining that and just sort of trying to have both perspectives in mind is just what I was trying to do. And yeah, like, just trying to always have the finance conversation along with the transition conversation, so people can see the connection and people can also understand, that it's something that's supposed to happen over the years. There's nothing absolute, there's nothing immediate that's ever going to come out of a COP, I think.
Yeah, I know it's a great perspective, and Tais, next year is meant to be a finance COP, as Stuti kind of mentioned. What do you expect really, and how can journalists maybe prepare themselves for these finance type of stories, these pledges that you've talked about that are often so hard to report on?
Well, I think as Stuti say, I mean, it could be something difficult or complex to talk about the connection between finance and climate change, but at the same time, something like really simple because it's connected with everything. And what I think, and there are a lot of stories that you could start even writing today about what could happen next year, because what we are seeing here is that the main goal of next COP is to have a new, have more clarity on the new goal on finance. In the meantime, that we have another goal that they were not fulfilled by the countries, the historical 100 billion annually dollars. So I think that you can already write stories about, okay, where is finance right now in terms of the compromise that were still not fulfilled? Where is finance in terms of adaptation? Because we couldn't have here the time to talk about the global goal on adaptation that was also approved at this COP. But one of the things that most of the parties, or most of the developing countries parties, were expecting to discuss at COP28 was about finance for adaptation, and try to make a more equal mobilization of finance between mitigation and adaptation. And that was not on the table, and not even on the final text. So I think finance is one of them, is like the main issue and the main core of all climate action issues that we have on the table is related with every of them. So I think it will be good not to only put the focus next year on the new global goal on finance, but also trying to see which are the other items that still are not complete or not fulfilled in regards of finance, and try to see on the both way, because I always think, of course, as a developing country from Latin America, but I will always say is, okay, first we need the money on the table, and that is not happening or not in a complete way. But then how our countries are preparing for that, because I don't think that most of the Latin American countries, sorry, that's the dog, are preparing to receive money. And then is the moment that, for example, for a Latin American country, the African region is maybe prepared for that, to receive the money. So how you are going then to discuss which is the project that you are going to present, a climate action project, in order to receive the money. And the third thing I think that we need to put the focus on is on transparency. How we are going to follow that, as Ryan mentioned at the beginning, we hear a lot about goals, about pledge, but how we are going to follow the money in order to first arrive where it's necessary, and second, arrive on time. So I think that there are a lot of things that we as journalists can and must follow in terms of climate finance. In Marrakesh, I remember that someone told me there's a meeting there on climate finance if you want to go, and I was like, no, I hate finance, and now is like the the big item that I need to follow. So I think it will be a good opportunity, not only for climate reporters, but also maybe an opportunity to also talk to your editors and other colleagues. Hey, this is a good big story. We need more journalists on board for this coverage. So yeah, I think it could be an opportunity to try to have a more big coverage of the COP, in terms not only as a climate COP, but also as something that affects other important things of the countries.
All right, so let's talk about the next 12 months then. Stuti, what are the political dynamics you're looking at over the next 12 months before we head to COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan? Are there any dynamics regionally that might affect things? And then what are some of the kind of global elements that you're going to be looking for to kind of act as a bit of a prelude to what you might expect in Baku?
I think mostly I was trying to focus on, in terms of COP-related coverage, I was trying to focus on a follow-up of, what basically how any of the pledges translated into action, those kind of things, and mainly the funds as well. loss and damage, definitely something of interest. But I was thinking of more on the lines of how how the year goes in terms of extreme weather events and in terms of like what really happens. So, I mean, I really feel like it's important to keep connecting COP conversations to the real world and just try and focus on your regular stories, day-to-day things, and just try to tie it all together. That why what was discussed there is somehow related to this, and what is going to be happening is, you need to keep this in mind when that discussion happens next. So I think that is just something that I will be trying to do. But because it's a finance specific COP, so I was thinking that I can maybe talk a little bit more about, do a little more in-depth stories about how the transition is happening here, just transition related stories here from South Asia, and basically, just trying to break things down for people that when we are talking about transaction, what exactly are we talking about? We are not just talking about, shutting down coal power plants, but we are talking about more jobs in renewables. We are talking about a different sort of energy sector. So I think those are sort of in-depth stories I was planning, but I don't really have any COP specific plan for next year. And I think I just try and plan less and less now when it comes to COPs, because a lot changes, and B, I think when you don't have everything planned, you actually go there and you try and make sense of it, and then you're able to see it from a slightly detached point of view. You feel like, okay, like, does it really make sense or not? And if that makes sense to you, then only you go ahead and report it. So instead of getting into the technicalities from the get-go and just trying to, be in that process throughout the year. I think I'm just trying to take a little step back from climate negotiations and focus on climate in general, and then go back to negotiations.
So
I
the
think we need
reality
to
is like
raise that part, because otherwise, how we are going to explain all the workshops for journalists on? Yes, you need to prepare. You need to make a plan for the coverage of next COP.
Well, to be honest, I mean, if what Stuti is saying is correct, if you've going into the next COP and you've talked about 6 climate finance projects that have or haven't been funded, or the transparency hasn't been reported on well, or you're talking about, transition plans that have or haven't been implemented, I mean, you're probably in a really good position to go into those negotiations and ask exactly those questions that you were talking about. What does this really mean to readers versus the kind of the negotiations and such. But Stuti, I'm a little bit disappointed. You didn't mention any elections happening next year that you might be looking at to influence the negotiations. I mean, I can certainly think of 1 or 2 off the top of my head that might be influential. Indonesia goes to an election in February, for one, which is, the largest coal exporter in the world. And they've been under a similar leadership for quite some time. There's a few other elections next year, though. Maybe I'll kind of pass on you and not put you on the spot. But Tais, are there any other political dynamics that you'll be looking out for leading up to Baku?
I mean, I'm trying to survive Argentina right now, so yeah, and trust me, it is really difficult. Democracy is under attack, so yes, I mean, this is going to be difficult. But in terms of the region, not only my country, there's elections in June in Mexico. That the 2 candidates are women, so it's going to be, I mean, one of them. So it's going to be like the first time that Mexico is going to have a woman's president. So anything is important, I think, because we all know like the role that Mexico has in the region as an oil producer country. Also, it will be interesting the next moves of Brazil, because Brazil's arrive next year as like a climate champion, and Lula was like, hey, it's the person we all want to hear. And this year in Dubai, it was like, what are you saying, Lula? Are you joining OPEC? Really? I mean, and he's fighting with Macron in regards of the agreement between Latin American and EU. So I think, considering that Brazil is going to host the COP after Azerbaijan, is going to be interesting to follow, and always because Brazil is the 7th most emitter country in the world. And well, no, I think as Stuti mentioned, I think it's, of course, it's good to follow and write the stories about the impact, the economical and social impact of the energy transition, because we are talking also in Latin America about countries that today depends more on fossil fuels. So it's interesting to see, no matter who is is on the leadership of the country, how public and private sectors are working or not for the energy transition, and also for other transitions related with climate. For example, the ones that are referred to the use of land, that I see Maxi here, and you can follow Maxi to see a lot of what happened in the use of land in South America and its connection with climate change. So yeah, I will say that in the short time, I only want to see watch Emily in Paris and nothing more. I need to, like to reconnect with something different from the climate negotiations. And after that, okay, where is Azerbaijan? How I'm going to take a flight from here to there? And then I'm going to try to think the climate year. But I think there are a lot of, there are always stories to follow on climate. It's not only about COP. And I think that is something useful to remember. We do not resolve all the issues at the climate conference. Climate conference is like a big push that then the country need to implement nationally, locally, and trying to make the world working. Sometimes that doesn't happen very well. But yeah, I don't know if that's a response to your question. I think that we are both trying to see, we are both trying to finish, like this year. Then let's see what happens next.
I totally understand it, but I didn't know that you were at Emily in Paris levels of desperation. So I'm going to have to check in with you later, Tais. You clearly need some more support.
Only way. No, I think that after COP, you really, really need a kind of content like Emily in Paris.
Okay. Well, I'm actually enjoying Lupin at the moment. I don't know if that's on the same level, but I can understand it, and certainly given the last 2 weeks that you've been through. Maybe as a last question for both of you, what do you see as the impact of COP28 on the world in the next year, in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years? Is there going to be an impact, if any, on the world going forward? Stuti, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I think how I take COPs now, I think is more about messaging and what the position is for all the countries, just that. I don't really try to make it more than that. So I think while we are reporting, I think it's going to be very important to constantly mention the fact that it is definitely, I mean, historic is probably a cliche word at this point, but it is definitely a big deal that finally a climate deal has actually acknowledged the fact that we need to transition away from fossil fuels. And a couple of years ago, I remember just mentioning some event that this is happening because of climate crisis used to be a long drill that you needed to find studies, you needed to find a lot of things. Now I think it's become a lot more usual for people to connect disasters with climate crisis and to connect it with fossil fuel burning. So I think that reporting has become a lot easier to state the fact that, hey, this is happening, but this is happening because of fossil fuel industry, or this is happening, or like this is what needs to happen. This is the call to action that that these people are responsible, or this particular area is responsible for what is actually happening to us. So I think that is how I take COP outcomes to make that point that this is what it is. But I think in the longer term, there's definitely going to be a lot of focus on energy transition. So that's definitely a place where I'm thinking of planning a lot more stories, a lot more local stories, to try and make sense of it for people. And just when it comes to pledges, just treat them as pledges. And when it comes to COP related things, just putting that in real terms, that this has been said and this is what is the real picture is, and just let people make sense of it on their own. So I think that's pretty much all. I don't really think that it's a major thing that people are going to talk about throughout the year, but as long as you keep connecting it to the real thing, I think it's going to make sense. So yeah.
Tais, how about you? Is there a long-term impact of COP28?
I don't know. I think as every COP, what I hope really, or I would love to, is that, I mean, I consider it's important that we start talking about the main responsibles of climate action with name and last name. So I think it's important that we need to remember that the Paris Agreement does not mention fossil fuels, because it was also a decision, and because I think otherwise we wouldn't have a Paris Agreement. So I think that is an important step. Maybe later they took like 28, 30 years to have it on a text. But I do hope, I would love to, that we continue the discussions with naming the responsibles with name and last name, and maybe talk a lot more and better about the energy transition, and especially thinking about the big media, because most of the industries that put money, that support the big media, are the one from the energy sector, and not particularly the renewables one. So I hope that this could be also an impact from the decision makers on the big or most popular media, to start making journalistic stories about the energy transition, but in the way we need. I mean, we need to talk about the cons and pros, the opportunities, the challenge, how to make a just transition with all the people on the table. And I'm saying that, for example, in a country that we have a lot of lithium, that yes, lithium is necessary for the energy transition, but the people on the local communities, they are not being heard by the authorities. So we need to talk about that. And you are not going to see those stories on the big media. So I hope that the thing that, yes, we have the historical COP that talks about fossil fuels. Okay, how we are going to continue about to communicate about that. So it's, I don't know if it's something that I know we are going to see. It's more like a wish, like a Christmas wish, that I hope it could have a positive impact, because we need more and better communication on the energy transition.
Well, that's potentially quite a poignant point to leave it on there. And if you're wondering where Ryan is, unfortunately, we lost him to the internet demons maybe about 10, 15 minutes ago, and the angels of the internet haven't brought him back yet. So if he jumps on board in the next 2 minutes while I'm rounding up, we'll definitely give him maybe the last say. But for now, I'd just love to thank Tais and Stuti. It's incredible you giving up your time for our small but hopefully useful audience. I wanted to thank Carolina and Maxi and everyone who jumped into the question segment, Mrinalini as well. Carolina, we were definitely going to get to your question, but I think Mrinalini jumped in and maybe has the most esteemed view of anyone here, to be honest. So I kind of maybe wanted to leave that there. To Sunli Wei as well, who jumped in on the chat, and to everyone who kind of woke up early or stayed up late for this as well. It's lovely to see some old faces, some old names, and obviously to kind of reflect on this. I think there's probably hundreds of other views we could have shared today, and another 1,000 other ways you could split up what to do next. But thank you so much for joining us. And you know, Climate Tracker, hopefully you would have seen some of the reporting from about 20 journalists online and in person throughout the last couple of weeks. If you haven't, let me know, and I'll let you know kind of who we had from your region and what they reported on. But otherwise, obviously, another COP, another year. We hope to do it all again, regardless of the impact on the world in real terms or not. I think there's always going to be a role for journalists right up until the moment the Titanic sinks. Unfortunately, someone's got to report the exact moment of sinking, right? With that being said, thank you so much, Tais and Stuti, for your time, for your reporting, for your energy, for being so kind of passionate and open with these reflections today. And thank you everyone for joining. It seems like we haven't given Ryan enough of a buffer, but I think we're going to have to leave it there. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Gracias.